football match, a World Cup qualifier, El Salvador versus Honduras. But sports, pride, and nationalism are powerful forces, and when combined with deep-seated grievances, they can become weapons more lethal than any gun. For years, Honduras had been grappling with land disputes. Thousands of Salvadoran immigrants had crossed the border seeking farmland. Hondurans felt encroached upon. Salvadorans felt oppressed. These tensions simmered silently, hidden in local disputes, police reports, and angry letters to newspapers. Then came June 1969. The first match in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, saw local fans erupt in anger. Shouts, riots, and vandalism filled the streets. Salvadoran players were harassed, fans attacked. The media on both sides fanned the flames, calling the other nation treacherous and unworthy. The second match in San Salvador didn't calm anything. In fact, it was worse. Violence broke out both on the pitch and in the cities. Newspapers splashed headlines screaming of betrayal and insult. And then came July 1969. El Salvador launched a military strike into Honduras. Airplanes roared, bombs dropped, and a war broke out that would last exactly 100 hours. What started as a game, a friendly sport in the minds of some, had now become a war. A war with 2,000 lives lost, tens of thousands displaced, and borders redrawn. Not by politicians, but by decades of tension ignited by the roar of a stadium crowd. The world watched football matches as simple competitions of skill and strategy. But in Central America in 1969, football was no longer a game. It was a symbol of national pride, anger, and unresolved grievances. Honduras and El Salvador had been quietly simmering in tension for decades. Land disputes in Honduras had left thousands of Salvadoran immigrants frustrated and desperate. Hondurans, meanwhile, felt their land was being invaded, their livelihood threatened. Rumors, resentment, and nationalistic pride spread like wildfire. When the first match kicked off in Tegucigalpa, stadiums filled with tens of thousands of screaming fans. Flags waved, drums beat, and chants echoed through the humid night. But beneath the excitement, something darker brewed. Salvadoran fans were harassed in the streets, their flags torn, their voices silenced by mobs. Honduran newspapers ran front-page stories portraying Salvadorans as invaders and cheaters. Meanwhile, Salvadoran newspapers fired back, calling Hondurans backward, aggressive, and unworthy of competition. By the second match, violence had already escalated. The cities were tense, the air heavy with anger. Fans clashed outside stadiums. Roads were blocked. Police struggled to maintain order. Each foul on the pitch was interpreted as an insult to an entire nation. Every cheer became a taunt, and the leaders, they did nothing to calm the situation. Politicians on both sides used the matches as propaganda, inflaming the fires of nationalism. Radio broadcasts stoked hatred. Citizens were primed for war even before a single soldier marched. Then came the decisive match in Mexico City, a neutral ground intended to settle the score. But even here, emotions boiled over. Violence erupted in the stands. Threats were exchanged. The match ended, but the anger didn't. The spark was ready, waiting for the perfect moment. Behind closed doors, military leaders in El Salvador were already planning. They saw an opportunity to resolve the tensions once and for all, not on the pitch but on the battlefield. By mid-July, all the simmering resentment, decades of land disputes, and the symbolic fury of a football rivalry had reached their breaking point. The world would soon witness how a sport could ignite a real war, one that would engulf both nations in chaos and death. By July 14, 1969, the simmering tension exploded. El Salvador's military, trained and ready, crossed the border into Honduras. Tanks rumbled across dusty roads. Fighter planes tore through the skies. What had begun as a rivalry on the football pitch had now transformed into a full-scale military conflict. The first strikes were swift and shocking. Honduran border posts were attacked. Roads were cut. Communications disrupted. Civilians awoke to the roar of engines and the whistle of bullets. Families fled in panic, unsure which way was safe. In the skies, Salvadoran planes dropped bombs on strategic locations. Smoke rose over border towns, the smell of fire and gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Soldiers moved with precision, but chaos reigned everywhere. For the ordinary people, it was incomprehensible. Farmers tending fields were suddenly engulfed in battle. Children who had cheered for their teams a week earlier now hid in basements, praying the war wouldn't reach them. Markets emptied as gunfire echoed. In the capital, Tegucigalpa, the government scrambled to respond. Communication lines were jammed. Emergency plans were enacted, but the speed of the invasion left them unprepared. Honduran soldiers fought bravely, but the Salvadoran forces pushed relentlessly, taking advantage of the confusion. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were stories of courage and desperation. Soldiers rescued civilians trapped in firefights. Families risked crossing dangerous territory to find safety. Even in the midst of war, human resilience shone through, but it was a war that was short, brutal, and merciless. The world watched in stunned disbelief. How could a conflict sparked by a football match escalate into a full-blown war within days? Yet for El Salvador and Honduras, this was the culmination of years of tension, resentment, and political failure. By the end of the first day, hundreds were dead, and the death toll would rise rapidly in the coming hours. The war had begun, and neither nation could predict where it would end. War is never just soldiers and borders, it is people. And in the football war, the real victims were the civilians caught between two nations fueled by anger and pride. In villages along the border, families woke to the distant rumble of tanks, the whistling of bullets, and the low hum of fighter planes overhead. Shops were abandoned, markets left to decay. Children clung to parents, confused and terrified. Grandparents, who had lived through decades of hardship, saw their homes turned into battlegrounds overnight. Stories emerged of families fleeing under the cover of darkness, carrying what little they could. Elderly men and women stumbled through fields, young children clinging to their mothers. Dust mixed with smoke, choking the air. Dogs barked frantically, livestock scattered, lost in the chaos. Some villages were hit directly. Bombs tore through houses, leaving ruins in their wake. Streets once full of laughter and life were now silent except for the moans of the injured. Mothers searched desperately for missing children. Fathers tried in vain to shield their families. The smell of smoke and fear hung in the air, a permanent reminder of a war that began over a game. Yet amidst the horror, acts of courage and humanity shone. Neighbors carried the wounded to safety. Doctors worked tirelessly in makeshift clinics, often without enough supplies. Volunteers risked their lives to evacuate civilians across dangerous territory. Even soldiers, amid the violence, sometimes paused to rescue those trapped in buildings or under rubble. In the cities, the media struggled to report the reality. Lines of refugees streamed across roads, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror. Reports of looting and chaos spread alongside the stories of bravery and survival. This was a war that lasted only 100 hours, but its impact on civilians was catastrophic. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, communities displaced. Tens of thousands of people would remember these days as a nightmare they could never wake from. By mid-July, the war raged relentlessly. El Salvadoran forces pushed deep into Honduran territory, and Honduran troops struggled to mount a defense. Tanks rolled through dusty roads, planes streaked across the sky, and the thunder of artillery shook villages to their foundations. For the soldiers, every hour was a test of courage. Ambushes, counterattacks, and the constant fear of unseen threats defined each day. The front lines shifted rapidly, towns changed hands, and confusion reigned. But the civilians bore the heaviest burden. Refugee columns stretched for miles, moving under the scorching sun with no certainty of safety. Food, water, and shelter were scarce. Families huddled in fields, hiding from bombs and bullets. Hospitals overflowed with casualties. Smoke and fire painted the horizon in ominous shades of gray and orange. The international community watched in disbelief. How could a football rivalry escalate into a real war in the heart of Central America? The United Nations and neighboring countries scrambled to intervene. Peace talks began behind closed doors, but communication was slow, and mistrust ran deep on both sides. After exactly 100 hours, a ceasefire was brokered. Both nations, exhausted and battered, withdrew troops. The war was over as quickly as it had begun, but its consequences were immense. Casualties were staggering, around 2,000 people killed, tens of thousands displaced, fleeing homes and towns, economies disrupted, infrastructure destroyed. The football war demonstrated how sports, pride, and unresolved social tensions could ignite a conflict with devastating human cost. And while it lasted only a few days, the memories, scars, and political consequences would linger for decades. This war, sparked by a seemingly trivial football match, remains a chilling reminder. Nationalism and human resentment can turn even games into tragedy. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of war lingered long after the last shell exploded. El Salvador and Honduras had survived 100 hours of devastating conflict, but the human and political toll was profound. For civilians, life would never return to what it once was. Homes destroyed, families displaced, communities torn apart. These were wounds that could not be repaired by a ceasefire. Children who had once cheered in stadiums were now haunted by memories of smoke, gunfire, and death. Farmers who tilled fields before the war returned to scorched earth and shattered livelihoods. Politically, the war forced both nations to confront the reality of their tensions. The conflict did not resolve land disputes or migration issues immediately, but it highlighted the dangers of letting national pride, resentment, and social inequality fester unchecked. Internationally, the football war became a cautionary tale. Nations and the United Nations realized that even small sparks, an event as innocuous as a sports match, could ignite real, deadly conflict if underlying issues were ignored. Scholars and historians would study this war for decades, not for its size, but for its alarming symbolism. How a game could expose the fragility of peace in a world simmering with tension. In El Salvador, the war left scars on the national psyche. The military celebrated its tactical success, but the cost weighed heavily on the people. In Honduras, resentment lingered, yet there was also recognition of the need for dialogue and reform. And yet, the football war remains remembered less for politics or borders, and more for its startling catalyst. A football match, a symbol of joy, competition, and unity, had ignited a devastating conflict. It was a lesson in human emotion, in how pride and anger can transform a game into tragedy. Today, the story of the football war serves as a haunting reminder. Beneath the roar of cheering fans, history's most dangerous sparks often lie hidden, waiting for the right moment to ignite.